Install and configure Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol Server role in Windows Server 2012 R2. So in this video, install and configure DHCP server role in Microsoft Windows Server 2012 R2. We will discuss briefly what is the DHCP server role, the DHCP process, the installation of the DHCP server role, the configuration of the DHCP server. Finally, we'll have the verification and testing. The DHCP server role helps to simplify client computer configuration by distributing network configuration information to network clients and network-enabled services. To put it simply, DHCP server allocates IP address, corresponding subnet mask, gateway, DNS, list time, and others to a client that is requesting for such. We will install a standalone DHCP server. It is a computer that is running Windows Server 2012 R2 in our case, that is not part of an ADDS domain, and that has the DHCP server role installed and configured. As for the DHCP process, there are 4 steps in this said process. You have the discovery, offer, request, and acknowledge. First, the DHCP client broadcasts a discover packet to every computer in the subnet. Only computers with DHCP server role, or perhaps those with DHCP relay agent, will respond to this broadcast. Next, the DHCP server responds with an offer packet which contains a potential address for the client. The requesting client receives the offer packet. It is possible that it could receive packets from multiple DHCP servers. The client then broadcasts a request that contains a server identifier. Then the DHCP servers receive the DHCP request. The server stores the IP address, client information in the DHCP database and responds with an acknowledge message. This will be our simple topology for our DHCP server demonstration. So we have a server with Microsoft Windows Server 2012 R2 installed already. This server will be configured with an IP address of 192.168.100.1/24, and it will be connected to our network switch. It will be a standalone DHCP server, so it is not a member of any ADDS domain. So we have our clients PC1 and PC2, so they will act as our DHCP clients. So they will obtain or hopefully obtain an IP address or IP information from our configured DHCP server. So this will be our Windows Server 2012 R2. So the computer name is already configured. The IP address 192.168.100.1 is also configured. If you take a look at the dashboard, you will see that it has no DHCP server roles or role installed. So let's go ahead and add the DHCP server role. So we go to dashboard and we select or add roles and features. So we click this one. So we have some instructions, so we click next. So role-based or remote desktop services installation, so will be role-based or feature-based installation. So click next. So this will be the server that we would like to be installed, or our DHCP server role to be installed. So click next, and we will now select our server role. So there are various server roles that are available in Windows Server 2012 R2, but for us, we will select the DHCP server role, and it will also include some management tools. So if applicable, so for example, the tools DHCP server tools. So let's add the remote server administration tools or RSAT tools, particularly the DHCP server tools. So click add features. So nothing much to select here as long as our DHCP server is selected. So click next. So we have some features or one or more features that are required to be installed. So we have the .NET framework is there. So it's currently 2 out of 7 is installed. So we have RSAT. So we have also the other features that are needed to be installed. So we click next, and it should begin the installation once we click next on this process. There's things to note here. So before we click next, so there are some things to note. So you should configure at least one static IP address on this computer, and yes, we did. We have 192.168.100.1, which is a static IP assignment to this computer. And before you install the HTTP server, you should plan your subnets, scopes, and exclusions, and store the plan in a safe place for later reference. So of course, in proper production network, you should have planned your network, so your subnets and the other parameters or the other settings, scopes and exclusions before we already plan or configure our DHCP server. So let's click next, and we have some options here to restart the destination server automatically. So we could check that, or we could go ahead and click install. So DHCP server and the RSAT tools, which contains the DHCP server tools. So for our confirmation, so let's click install, and it should start the installation process. So we will wait for the installation process because it will not take that long. So we have some progress bar that is running here, and hopefully in a few seconds it will be done. Okay, so configuration required, installation succeeded on the server. So there is here to launch the DHCP post install wizard to complete the DHCP server configuration. We could do this one, or we could just simply close this and configure it later or complete the DHCP server configuration. So you could export your configuration settings for proper documentation, or we could just hit close in this one. So as you can see, we have some notifications that is here, and we have the configuration required message, still the same, that you need to complete your DHCP configuration. But the installation of the DHCP server role is succeeded, however, pending your configuration on the DHCP server. There are various ways to complete or to configure our DHCP server. So of course, I can go to the notification and click this complete DHCP configuration. Or I could go to dashboard and click this DHCP server role group. And on this server, I could right click and click this DHCP manager. Or I could go to start menu, administrative tools, and look for the DHCP manager as well, that is here. So in the server manager dashboard, in the notification, there is a complete DHCP configuration. So we'll click this one, and we will click commit. So commit meaning to say create the following security groups for delegation of DHCP server administration. So we have DHCP administrators and DHCP users, and click commit, and this should be done. So please restart the DHCP server service to do so or to be effective. Please click close. So I've opened the services console. I scroll and find the DHCP server service, and we will restart this DHCP server service. And it should be done. And we should close this service and proceed with our configuration. So let's select this instead. So let's double click and let's maximize this. So we are now at the DHCP manager. So we have one server. So we have IPv4. Okay, so let's expand this one. And we have also IPv6. So under the IPv4, it will give you a message that a scope is needed or you need to add a scope. And we will get back to that. So we have some server options, we have some policies, and we have some filters wherein we can allow and deny. So let's go back IPv4. So it tells here that a scope is a range of IP addresses that will be assigned to the computers requesting for a dynamic IP address. So you must create and configure a scope before any dynamic IP addresses can be assigned. So of course, this will be a very important task in DHCP server configuration. So we will create a new scope. So in order to create a new scope, so on the action menu, click new scope. So we could go to action menu and click the new scope. So we now launch the new scope wizard. So let's click next. So this will now be our scope name. So for example, this will be our LAN, and for simplicity, our description is local area network. Of course, you could name your scope to whatever. For example, this is intended for a department or a particular network, so you must name the scope appropriately. But as this is a demonstration purposes, so I'm okay with this. So we click next, and the first one is IP address range. So we need to define the address range. So we have the starting IP address and the ending IP address. So take note, our server is on the first usable IP address 192.168.100.1. So we should start, or we should not include that on our starting IP address. So perhaps we should start at 100 and we should end on the 200 as an example. Okay, so remember, this is the usable IP address. So we have, in IP addressing, we have network address, we have broadcast address. So the range should be the valid host IP address. So below is the length or the classless interdomain routing notation. So currently is /24 or 24, and the subnet mask is 255.255.255.0. So in our simple example, so we will just use the /24. So we will be okay with this, and we will be clicking next. Next is add exclusions and delay. So for add exclusion, so suppose we have an IP address from that lease range 192.168.100.100 to 192.168.100.200 that we don't want to give out to our dynamic clients and exclude that IP. So for instance, I don't want 192.168.100.150 to be given out, so I will add this one as an exclusion. Okay, so let's click next. Next is the lease duration. So the lease duration specifies how long a client can use an IP address from this scope. So you can set the duration to days, to hours and minutes. So the default is 8 days. So for instance, we will not provide a lease of 8 days. So we'll just select perhaps an hour as particular example. So again, it depends on your scenario. So it could be a guest network wherein it could be a shorter lease, or it could be an office network wherein it could be a longer lease duration. So let's click next. So next is configure DHCP options. So these are the options that we could provide to our clients. So what are these options? So options are, for example, the IP address of your default gateway, the IP address of your DNS server, and there are many other DHCP options. So of course, we would like to provide the gateway IP to our client as well as a DNS server IP as a minimum. Okay, so that's why if the question is, do you want to configure the DHCP options for this scope now? Of course, we will select yes, I want to configure these options now. So let's click next. So in our first DHCP option, you will specify the IP address of our router. So or our default gateway. So in our example, so we could add here a single entry, which is 192.168.100.254, although in our simple topology there is no router. So however, let's just prepare one. So let's add this IP. Okay, so the IP address of our default gateway is added. So let's click next. Next in our DHCP option is domain name and DNS servers. So we don't have any Active Directory domain in our simple topology. So we could leave the parent domain blank. We don't have also DNS servers that are present in our network. So we'll just skip the server name and resolve it. So we have a public DNS, which is the quadruple 8 instead. So that will be it for now. So we will click next. So let's click next. Next is Win server. So we don't have any Win server in our environment. So let's click next. So activate scope. So of course, we want this scope to be activated. So we could test now and verify if our users are able to get the IP address from our DHCP server. So let's click next. And by selecting yes, I want to activate this scope now. Let's click next. And this should complete our DHCP server configuration. So click finish and the scope is added. So let's review our new scope. So it should be under IPv4. So we have a scope for our network address 192.168.100.0 and the name of the scope is LAN. So it is from here that we could also modify or change some values in our scope. But for now, let's view. So address pool. So this will be the addresses that will be distributed. So from 100 to 200, this will be the excluded IP from our sample. Let's take a look at our leases. We don't have any clients that has been offered or been given an IP address yet, since we never turned on our test DHCP clients. So we don't have reservations for now. We have some scope options. So we have our router and we have our DNS servers. So in case you want to make some changes with your address range, so if you take a look at address pool, if you right click, you don't have anything to modify here. So instead you go to scope and right click and go to properties, and you could now modify your start and ending IP address as well as the lease duration. Also here in the scope options, however, here you could have the properties and therefore change the value of the particular scope. As you can see, there are a lot of scope options that are available here, and there's also an advance for more DHCP options. So I have here my test client. So we have host name INQ01. So currently the network adapter is disabled. So let's enable that one. And let's configure, or it's already configured as an dynamic client, but let's verify. Let's go to properties, and yes, it's obtained an IP address automatically set on this Ethernet adapter or network adapter. So let's verify from here if it did get an IP address, and yes, it gets an IP address 192.168.100.104, and the default gateway is correct. The DHCP server, yes, 192.168.100.1, and the DNS server is quad 8. So we could also verify from here, and we should still get the same information. So we could verify from the server side this time, or from our DHCP server manager. So we could go to the correct scope, and we go to address leases, and yes, we have a client which match our host name INQ01 with the correct IP address 192.168.100.104. So in this video, install and configure DHCP server role in Windows Server 2012 R2. So as a summary, we have briefly discussed the DHCP server role. We briefly discussed also the DHCP process. Then we proceeded to the DHCP server role installation and the required features. So we configure our DHCP server. So we committed to the creation of security groups. Then we have added a new scope, wherein our new scope contains the lease range. We have also the subnet mask and the DHCP options, for example, the default gateway or our router, as well as the domain name and the DNS server's IP. From there, we boot up one of our test clients and configure it to obtain an IP address. And from our testing, yes, indeed, it got an IP address from our DHCP server. And we verify it from our DHCP server side in our DHCP manager. So under the address leases, indeed, it is reflected that there is one computer that's been leased out with an IP address. So I hope you find this video helpful, and thank you for watching.